My name is Christopher Caproni, and I'm fortunate to have recently, 10 years ago, met John at the Redwoods. I'm getting this happens at the Redwoods. Stand closer to the microphone. I met John approximately 10 years ago when my in-laws, my wife's in the front row, her parents lived at the Redwoods, John and Dolores Hiskis. And we're 38-year residents of Mill Valley. We lived at the top of the Dipsy Steps in an old historic home, but that's not why I'm here tonight. But I do love history, and thanks to Nancy Emerson, Steve Quarles, Stella, we're here tonight to speak with you and have what we're going to call a fireside chat. So just imagine there's a burning fire here. We tried to do that, but we were told the equipment wouldn't last if we had a fire. So, and as you may know, fireside chats began with John's grandfather in the White House. So it's very fitting we have this meeting upstairs instead of downstairs. And we found out very quickly that downstairs wouldn't hold us, which is wonderful. So I met John approximately 10 years ago, and I had a purpose. I don't know if I ever told John this, but I was going to New York to visit my stepmom, and we were going up to the Hudson River to Hyde Park, amongst other places like the California, was it the American Academy of Culinary Institute? CIA, yeah, different one. You know it. And Storm King and the town of Beacon. And of course, I was thrilled to know we were going to be going to Hyde Park. So I immediately called Dolores and said, please get me a date with John. So she arranged for lunch. We met at the, in Mama's Royal Cafe. One of the booths was decorated like Casablanca. I can tell a nod of head people remember. And we had a wonderful time. And I asked John for his memories of Hyde Park. And I'd forgotten when I asked him that he was very young. He was somewhere between 0 and 6. And his memories were riding the dumbwaiter, which thrilled me to hear because I would do the same thing. And then another one was being under the Christmas tree and then playing by his grandfather's feet in his office at the house there, which is now, of course, a presidential library. So let me see if I can do this right. These are our participants. We've got John, of course, here, and John's being held by his father. His mother is next to him, and his grandmother is next to her. Okay. So John's approximately, 4 years of age, maybe 3? 3. This photograph. You guys see the likeness? Good. So to finish the story off, so I went to Hyde Park, and let me see if I can get to the picture. I had this picture taken while I was there, and I amused by telling John they're not really bronze, they're made of chocolate. But if any of you have been to Hyde Park, this is a picture you can take, okay? So let me see if I can remember how to back up. Okay, so there's John's lovely face in his biography. Would you like me to read it, or is it not necessary? Some of this has already been shared in the invitation. Okay, Mia Monroe. By the way, we have royalty in the room tonight, and I didn't start by saying that, but we have Roosevelt royalty and we have National Park Service royalty. Mia recently retired after 50 years of service. She didn't want me to say that, and she didn't want applause, but too bad, Mia. And there was a speech read by Jared Huffman in the U.S. Congress on April 30th, I believe, of this year, honoring Mia for her service. She's a volunteer still in the national parks in Muir Woods, and her favorite things are butterflies and flowers. When you get her voicemail, she'll tell you that. So what happened was, after going to Hyde Park, I didn't see John again for almost 10 years. And Robin and I, my wife and I, were biking by the Redwoods, decided to go in and look at the bulletin board, see what was happening, and found out John was speaking the following Monday on his grandmother, Eleanor. And it was an incredible experience for us to hear you speak about her. And the moment I saw that, I said, you need a bigger audience. There are more people that want to hear the story. And afterwards, went up to John and said, John, did you know there's a plaque in Muir Woods in the Cathedral Grove dedicated to your grandfather, a month after he passed? and it was at the opening of the United Nations. And as we started talking with Nancy and Stella about doing tonight, realized that, what's the Mill Valley connection? And that's what John asked. He says, look, I just live here. Well, there's nearly no connection. I said, well, John, there apparently is. You didn't know it, and you did know it, because he later told me, you know what, I've seen this plaque before, I've been here. So I had not seen it, and I was thrilled that we, on a late August day, we arranged to pick up John, my wife and my daughter and I, had coffee with him, and took him over to Muir Woods, where we were met by Mia and Susan Ives, who's sitting in the front row here and is the communications director for the Living New Deal. And there's information handout at the end of this talk tonight about the Living New Deal. And we had 2.5 hours together and over a 2-mile walk through Muir Woods, and we learned a lot of things. And so, very inspired by that. John was very inspired, and I said, John, I think we can get you a bigger audience. Do you want to do that? And he was, yeah, let's do it. So here we are tonight. Let's get on with it. Okay, I'm done. And so now the conversation begins between Mia and John. And John's on the right here, by the way.
Thank you, Christopher, for bringing us together and helping form a story and the connections to the bigger world and how we've moved through them and here in Mill Valley. And also, when we were talking yesterday, and I was hearing yet more interesting observations, John, and you were bringing us up to the connections that you had with your grandparents, I all of a sudden was reminded of an Aristotle quote, because a lot of your stories are of your childhood and how that shaped the man sitting here. And Aristotle said, give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man. Because you've had an extraordinary life, but we can see today how those incredible grandparents of yours really echo down into who you are today. So thank you for sharing some of the very poignant stories. And the first ones are of early John, because he was in the wartime White House. He was a little child at play while the rest of the world was at war. And the way you told those stories about your grandparents was so poignant, about how they were also loving people who kept the family together and provided many, many special moments for you. So would you share with us what it was like being under the Resolute desk?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Can you hear all right? That takes me way back. I was born in 1939, and my dad, we were living on Mercer Island in Lake Washington, just off Seattle, and my dad went to war, and my grandfather, within a few days, called my mother from the White House and said, he called her Sis. Sis, why don't you, John's gone. You've got this house that you know, the two of you are rattling around in. Why don't you come and live with me? And that was a joy to her. It wasn't yet a joy to me. This was a disaccommodating, if that's a word. But it became such. And I remember literally the first steps into the White House, and came to feel it in those years. We lived in the White House. I lived in the White House from, well, all the entire period of the United States participation in World War II. So from late 41 to 45. And wouldn't have left were it not for the fact of my grandfather's death. And I'll keep these brief initially, because I'd love to hear your questions and those of our good friends who are here. And But those formative years were the years in which I knew my grandfather, because his death on April 12, 1945 I was hospitalized at the moment. I was just a staph infection, but I heard of the president's death, on the radio, and I couldn't. I mean, I was 6, so I couldn't make sense. I couldn't connect the experience with the death of my grandfather, and it wasn't until except a nurse came running in and turned off the radio, not knowing that I'd already heard. So that period of playing with, let me just tell a few words about my experience with him, and I'll do that briefly. When he didn't have somebody more important in the Oval Office, I was free to come in and play. He kept the Resolute desk, which has been the desk of the White House for God knows how long, was full in those years by his preference of toys. So I could play contentedly on the floor while he went about the business of the world. I swam with him. Not having the use of his legs was a major part of his life. Swimming was a joy because he could move. And so we swam together. He was a master dunker in the pool. And I, among other things, became attached to the self-service elevator in the White House and would sometimes command it when I wasn't particularly welcome to. And I remember one time hearing a buzzing, and of course it was somebody wanting to make use of the elevator for the purposes that it was designed. And I got up to the second floor and found my grandfather and Winston Churchill waiting for, and my grandfather, thankfully, said, it was very kind, said, "Johnny, there are other purposes for which this elevator is needed, and we need to go downstairs." Times that Churchill was in the White House, well, that's another story, and I'd be happy to talk about that some. But let me stop, Mia, now.
Well, I remember you sharing other intimate moments like the Sunday morning comics.
Oh, right, we did. He had a very enormously strong upper body, and I would go into his bedroom in the morning. I was then the only child living in the White House, and he would just lift me onto his bed, and we would read the funny papers together. He would read the funny papers to me. So, yes, thank you.
And we just can't move on to other things until you tell the memorable Thanksgiving dinner.
The memorable
Thanksgiving dinner.
Oh, the Thanksgiving dinner that Mia is referring to was at the White House, and I was probably 4 or so. My grandfather was at one end of the table. My grandmother was next to him, and he was carving, which was sort of a Roosevelt phenomenon. And he looked down the table. There were probably 10 people on each side, family members mostly, and there was someone with a silver tray waiting for whatever he'd cut, and he said, "Johnny, I bet you want a drumstick." And I said, "Yes, Papa." And he said, "Okay, here it comes." And he actually through it. And I mean, thank God for his aim, because it was sort of an arc like this, but I caught it, you know, these heavy linen napkins, and I caught it right in the middle of a linen napkin. So that was a memorable Thanksgiving.
Well, thanks for those childhood stories of being in the White House. And as we know, FDR was deep in the business of not only running the country, but meeting world leaders like Winston Churchill here. What else is up next, John?
Sorry?
I was just going to say, oh, there we are. Okay, I'm wondering, did you ever see this car?
Well, only in the photos that you've shown me, you and Christopher have shown me, that he's, I gather, in San Rafael.
Well, this is actually a really wonderful news story because we didn't know about this car and we didn't know about Franklin Delano Roosevelt visiting San Rafael. Do you mind sharing that one, Christopher? Because it's kind of an amazing thing about how this evening prompted this whole story.
Thank you. The question came through Nancy Emerson from someone who I think is a member of the Mill Valley Historical Society, and said she wouldn't be here tonight, but she wanted to know what John knew about his grandfather being in Marin County. And I asked John, and he didn't know. And so, of course, Googled it and found this. And it wasn't a long story, but he was on a tour of the United States after World War II broke out, and the United States got involved following Pearl Harbor. And he was inspecting the munitions and manufacturing capacity of the United States, and he was visiting Air Force, Army bases, naval bases. So he came to the United States, to California, and this was a secret mission, by the way, this entire tour that he took, until these pictures were taken, of course, and published while he was rolling down the street, apparently, leaving Hamilton Air Force Base on his way back to San Francisco. So, and there is more to this, and I'll let Mia take over from here, but there's a connection to the Potomac, which was the presidential yacht, which many of you may not know, or some do. I see a nod of heads, is in Jack London Square, and you can actually sail on it. But John helped restore it. It had sunk near Treasure Island, and John led the effort to get it pulled out and brought to Oakland and raise the money to have it restored for our use today. So.
Absolutely. Can I just describe that for a second?
Sure,
Christopher,
of course.
that the Potomac when it was a presidential yacht, my grandfather was afraid of one thing, fire, because of his lack of ability to move. And so the Sequoia, which was the existing presidential yacht that he inherited in 1933, was made of wood. So he traded the Sequoia for the Potomac, which was made of steel. And after he died, it had a pretty checkered career. I think, among other people, Elvis Presley owned it for a few years. But it finally was birthed on Treasure Island, just on one of the piers on Treasure Island. Well, both sides are Bayside, but the one further away from Oakland. And in the course of a storm on the bay, it sunk. So what I discovered was the fact that the Potomac had been sunk off in San Francisco Bay. So with the real work was done by Teamsters, which I think my grandfather would have appreciated, and it was towed back to the Port of Oakland. It's still there, and it's been thoroughly rehabilitated as it was when it was the presidential yacht, and it can be rented. It can be, it's actually, I think one of my cousins is the current executive director of the Potomac. So, but I've taken groups over there. It's a wonderful ship.
Hey, John, I can comment. That second smokestack in the back was apparently converted to an elevator. Did you know that? For your grandfather,
know that.
to be able to go from the
course. Yeah.
private quarters below to the deck. So if you go there and see the ship, you open the door, it's not a smokestack. It's an elevator.
Will, could you take us back to World War II?
Just like that. Which part?
So as we've learned, John's home was the wartime White House, and those meetings with
I looked a little bewildered. I was a little bewildered.
anyone else you want to point out in the picture there?
The picture, Frank III, FDR III, he never used that name. He called himself Frank, he still does, but he's standing taller as on one leg of our common grandfather, and my brother is in the military school uniform on the left, held by my grandmother, and a variety of cousins. I think this was, if I'm not mistaken, sort of Christmas or Inauguration Day of 1944. So it was late, and it's remarkable to me that when you look at my grandfather's face, there's such pleasure about being the paternal presence in this family, which could be pretty rambunctious.
So if this is 1944, we have those wonderful family gatherings. We also have Winston Churchill and other leaders visiting. And we also, out here on the West Coast, President Roosevelt was planning to gather world leaders to form an organization to find another way to deal with conflicts rather than war. And he was planning a gathering of those delegates here in San Francisco. And the opening was planned to be at Muir Woods. And as a retired park ranger, I find it so moving that Roosevelt was connecting nature and peace. That was his Secretary of Interior's suggestion, to have it among those beautiful redwoods just north of San Francisco, where you felt peace when you walked, you were connected to bigger thoughts, and also, no matter what language you spoke, the language of nature was universal. But unfortunately, as we heard from John, our president died suddenly. So people were gathering, but the world was mourning as well. And John, do you want to that was very, very moving that as a young child, you didn't really realize that your grandfather, what did you call him, by the way?
Papa.
Uh-huh. So just briefly tell us how you learned that he had suddenly passed away.
Well, I think I spoke of the experience of hearing about it without understanding it, because I was in that Bethesda Naval Hospital. And that was an interesting way to leave the White House, because I never went home again there. We moved back to Seattle and then down to Phoenix and roundabout.
Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, the delegates were gathering in San Francisco, and what had been planned as an opening in the Redwoods was instead transitioned to a memorial for our late president. And this is the plaque that John and Christopher and Robin and I visited in Cathedral Grove, still a place of peace and a place where I've been honored to welcome many United Nations gatherings and people, and a place that I just truly feel is the heart of the forest. But also, this is also my moment to share my own personal connection here, because my mother was growing up in San Francisco, and while the delegates were gathering, she was working for the newspapers in San Francisco, helping them break the news, who's arrived, who's doing what. But more importantly, my great uncle ran UC Press in Berkeley, and he was recruited to be the one to design and print the United Nations Charter. And he tells many stories of the late nights as yet one more draft had to be developed. And also the biggest challenge in a gathering that was meaning to give every nation equal status, how did he use the charter to help depict that? And his solution was the 5 major languages on each of the pages. So we have one that's printed here, and I have one of the drafts from my grandfather, my great uncle rather, up here if you want to see that. So I grew up with that heritage, and so I felt truly honored to work at Muir Woods with its deep connections to the feelings of peace. But your life really changed, and we've been talking about your papa, your grandfather, but you had a real close and profound connection to your grandmother. What did you call her?
My name for my grandmother was Grand-mère. She was bilingual virtually from birth due to her caretakers. And I didn't really know her in those White House years that I've described because she was always traveling. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with that. I mean, her independence, her deciding that she really didn't want to be a standard first lady, and so she was all around the world during my grandfather's presidency and well after. And the time that I came to know her was when I was an undergraduate at Amherst College in Massachusetts. I remember my mother, and then who had then remarried, and my stepfather were going to be abroad. They were creating a new medical school in Shiraz, Iran, and so Grand-mère said, "Johnny, I know," it's so characteristic of her, that I know you won't have a home to come back to during your vacations from Amherst. So I want you to know that for as long as they're gone, my home is your home. And so whether she was in Hyde Park at Valkill, which was the name of the home not the big house, which had become the national monument, but her own home, which I guess has now also become a national monument in Valkill. And I spent lots of time with her there, both during my years in college and before. I used to drive her to church, partly because no one else who was staying with her wanted to go. But I became both absorbed in her. I mean, she really had a spiritual tradition. I mean, and that this was not, a passing phenomenon. And to the degree that I've inherited that tradition, I've been very grateful. I'm thinking of those times that I drove her. The other reason I drove her to church was that she was a pretty terrible driver. That she would be she would be driving Franklin Jr. unbeknownst to me and unwisely had given her a Fiat sports car. And I mean, wrong decision. And so she'd be idling at the entrance to Route 9G, at the end of the driveway, and she'd be talking to me in the other seat, and she'd look to one side, look to the other side, but then about 3 minutes passed before she decided to take off. And so it really seemed the kindest thing for me to do, to take over the driving. And she was, I don't know how to say it in more particular terms. Maybe you could help Mia with that, with those years.
Well, I'm wondering if, Christopher, you could go back to our first Eleanor picture, because I was telling the story of the charter, but I really feel like this is one of her most significant contributions.
Yes.
And this influenced you too, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so we're looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
We are indeed, yeah. She was appointed by Truman to delegate to the United Nations, the American United Nations delegation, and at first said no, said, I'm not competent. Well, phooey. I mean, if anyone was competent to do that work, I'm not sure she was recognized as such initially by her compatriots on that delegation, but they came to appreciate the quality of her devotion. And I don't know whether it's still a record, but the only time I've known that the General Assembly of the United Nations stood in ovation was when she presented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the United Nations General Assembly.
Well, I learned yesterday of a couple of other aspects to this. You too were active in United Nations work, right?
She and I both. I mean, I inherited it, I think, from her, but I was leading something called the Collegiate Council for the United Nations back in the day, and when I was still an undergraduate. She was on the adult version of the American Association for the UN. So we sat together, usually right across from each other in the board meetings. And I came to realize that she was a master of many things, but one of them I hadn't recognized before, and that was the master of the power nap. that her head would decline, and I don't think anybody else knew that she was asleep, but because she would wake, and it was a slow raising of her head, but she, of course, the agenda hardly differed from one meeting to another, but she would be right there with whatever the issues were. And that was a remarkable coincidence.
Yeah. I also found the other time when you two were on a stage together, very moving, you as president of your class. And do you mind sharing what happened then at Amherst?
Oh, yeah, she came to Amherst College, 3 times during my tenure there as a student. At one time, when I returned to Amherst as a faculty member, and spoke. But the most meaningful time was when she came as the commencement speaker. I was a senior and president of the class, so we got to walk in to the ceremony together. And I think even back in the day, I would think, when I was listening to her, I would think, are you going to make really good sense out of this? I mean, what a stupid question to ask, because she made good sense out of so much that I was unaware of.
And then, if you don't mind, there was the time when you were sharing just what kind of a woman, what kind of a world leader, what an impression she was making on the world. You wanted to share that with your classmates, and you wrote something, and then as I heard it, you shared it with her to edit. Would you mind sharing that story a little bit?
Remind me of Mia.
Well, what I heard from you is that you wrote a very beautiful paper about the work she was doing and the impression that she was having not only on you but on the world. And she had you pull up a chair in front of the fire, and
Oh, yeah.
want to pick up on it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, this was while I was living with her, and I wrote a short piece, an essay about the United Nations, and I said, Grandmère, I'm going to go work elsewhere for the day. If you have time to read it between now and when I come home, I'd be grateful for your thoughts. And so when I came home, I expected her to be asleep because it was after midnight, but no, she was at her desk. The only light, a gooseneck lamp over her desk, and the fire in the fireplace. And I asked her, of course, Grandmère, did you have a chance to read my essay, single-minded that I was? And she said, yes. Actually, what struck me, she said, was how much your writing is kin to the writing of your father. I mean, how she could have picked up on that. My father had died 8 years before, and essentially from depression. And so my mother, I think, had it making what I think then was probably, from her point of view, a wise decision, that not to talk about it unless I initiated the conversation. And so in 8 years, I'd heard almost nothing about my dad. So she said, let's go and sit by the fire, and I'll tell you about him. That for another hour, we just sat by the fire, and we talked about how much she loved him, how much she admired his writing and his newspaper career, how much she wished that she had prevented his premature death. It was a moment in that sense of connectedness that we had that was most memorable to me.
It was a very moving story. We have another one coming up there. If you could go to her carrying her suitcase.
Oh.
So what's going on there? Why is she, what's she doing?
I love this picture because she's simply on the tarmac at LaGuardia and carrying her own suitcase, walking to the plane, but on the road, as she was so often. We would travel together in Europe as well as in the States. But it's just the kind of picture that reflects her character, alone but on a mission.
So let's imagine she's flying off to, was it Brussels, and you got a phone call?
Oh, I was working for this UN organization, and of which she was doing the adult version, and I was at a conference in Berlin, and she called me from Brussels and said, Johnny, I want you to come here for lunch tomorrow. And I said, Grandmère, I barely knew how to get to Berlin. I sure as hell don't know how to get, no, I didn't say hell. I sure don't know how to get from Berlin to Brussels. Can we do it another time? No, we can't do it another time because a guest is going to join me for lunch here in Brussels, and I want you to meet that guest. So it became kind of mystery for me, and I managed to find an old Polish Airlines had captured an old DC-3 from the war, and decorated it as a kind of Victorian tassel. And it flew from Berlin to Brussels. But we were taking these sort of slow dives down and then suddenly a turn up, and did that a half dozen times. And I thought, what on earth is going wrong? Well, what was going wrong was that the Polish pilot spoke neither English nor French, which were the two languages, that he would have needed to be guided into the airport. So he had his own way of guiding himself into the airport. It was foggy, but it was the telephone poles flashing by that I remember of anything. But it was all worth it. The guest turned out to be Harry Belafonte. So it was a command performance that really worked, and I was grateful for. I wanted also to recognize a couple of people here. Gray Brecken, the founder of the Living New Deal. Where's Gray? Here, right here. Susan Ives of the Living New Deal. Harvey. Who else? Anybody else? But
that kind of brings you to our next question, John. What are you doing here in Mill Valley? And how fortunate we are, because thank you for recognizing.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, because this is how we met.
That's right down the road.
Yeah. And because of the connection to Muir Woods, I was involved in the 50th, the 60th, the 70th, and the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. But that was May 2020. And as you all know, we were sheltering in place. So it was considered possibly the last time that the United Nations could celebrate an anniversary with many of the people who were involved still alive. So we were determined at Muir Woods to still do something. And we created some videos, and Susan Ives, who you just introduced, brought you. And we walked down here in Old Mill Park, and we had the different pillars of important things that the United Nations does, because it's not just discussion and trying to figure out solutions for peace. The United Nations is also committed to such important goals as everybody being able to eat, everybody living in a safe world, women being educated, etc., a clean environment. So there's many others, and so you and I, Susan and others, we shared that vision of the world when a whole different illness was gripping. And so that kind of brings us to, because I'm so glad that you introduced Harvey, Susan, and Gray, because here you were in Mill Valley, and you four are helping share Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vision through the Living New Deal. And did we have another next slide? Maybe. Well, what I was getting at is if another part of...
Would it be this one?
Yeah. So one other thing that Christopher and John and I learned was that Truman was also cruising around the Bay Area, and not only was he here to sign the United Nations Charter and represent the United States, but he was also looking around at possible places for the United Nations to be headquartered. And this is a plan for a possible location at Strawberry. And I guess we can talk more about it, or someone might share more during our questions and answers. But my hunch is your life might have been kind of different had it been here in Marin. You might have been here sooner than you finally arrived. And thank you for acknowledging the Living New Deal and the Potomac. But why do we get you here? What brought you here?
What brought me here really was I'm a psychologist, and I worked for 7 years in a psychiatric community teaching staff in Norway. and it was an absolutely wonderful experience. The only downside was the fact that my wife contracted ALS on a consulting tour, and so I came back to the States to spend the last years of her life with her. But I, having done that, and after my wife's death, two of my three sons, I almost said boys, sat with me in Lee's and my home in Dedham, Massachusetts, and said, Dad, you've been living in a community in Norway for 6 or 7 years. We have another community in mind for you. And it turned out to be the Redwoods. I mean, I was maybe a little young 71 for the Redwoods, but it's been 12 years, and I've really enjoyed it. It's full of thoughtful activity. I guess that's the best way to say it. Lots of groups, seminars, in effect, Gray spoken there, others, and that's been special to me. I actually wanted to just say one other thing that is out of chronological orientation, that it's another sort of Churchill FDR story. It's very, I can say it quickly. The two of them were having a conversation. I wasn't involved, but it became part of my repertoire as I came to understand it. They were having an intense conversation and then went to their own bedrooms at the end of the experience. And my grandfather sort of had this light go on that said, oh, there's one thing that I really meant to tell him. I'm going to go back. So he goes back, and he's so excited by what he wants to say to Churchill that he just opens the door and comes in, and there is, you can imagine him, Winston Churchill, pink and naked. And my grandfather, of course, having been brought up as he was, started to back out. And Winston Churchill said, no, come in. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States.
You went there. You didn't think you were going to do it.
Well, do we have time for a few questions from the audience? Or?
John, I was wondering if you'd like to invite Gray or Susan to say anything about the Living New Deal.
Would you say a word about the Living New Deal?
Well, sure. The Living New Deal is about, how old would you say, Harvey? 12 years? No, it's older than that. Anyway, it's about 15 years. Harvey and I came up with the idea around the same time. And what we do is we identify the artifacts left by the New Deal agencies, which are all around us, completely indispensable, and yet we don't see them because most of it's not labeled. But we couldn't do without it. And so what we're trying to do is to show that it's not just physical artifacts, but it's an ethical language that comes from Franklin and Eleanor and the people that they gathered around themselves. It's a language we've forgotten how to speak. And Park School right here in Mill Valley and the Mill Valley City Hall and Fire Station are all New Deal, but they're not labeled as such. So we're now a nationwide team effort all around the country, and we have a website, and we have a map which keeps growing. We've now got 18,000 sites around the country, but we know that there are hundreds of thousands to go. And so it's a great, wonderful project. And if you know of any New Deal projects, let us know. But, and I also give talks about it, as I did to the Redwoods, and I'd be happy to talk to any group about it because it's such an exciting and it's a redemptive project, especially in dark times like this, to find out what they were capable of doing. And the ultimate New Deal project was what John was just talking about, the United Nations, which was Franklin's idea. It's just a tragedy what has happened to the United Nations because it was Franklin's hope that it would end war for all time because, of course, when it was established, Franklin was one of the few people who knew about the Manhattan Project, and he knew that the next war would be the last one. And so it's fascinating to see that drawing by Ernest Bourne. The person who actually came up with that idea was William Worcester, the architect who was, I think, the head of MIT at that time. He got Bourne to do those drawings for Strawberry Point. And it's interesting, in some alternate reality, the United Nations is in Tiburon, or Mill Valley, I guess. And imagine how different the world history might have been at that time. Anyway, enough. Thank you, Mia.
Can I can.